Today we're going to be connecting the interdimensional dots for Stranger Things Season 4, Part 1. As you all may know, Stranger Things Season 4, Part 1 has just recently debuted on Netflix. And it's one of the biggest, if not the biggest, debuts and trending topics that Netflix has ever seen in its entire history. Now for this video today, we're going to delve back into the horror and sci-fi aspect of the channel, which there's only one other video on the channel to go about that aspect to begin with. We're going to be connecting the interdimensional dots for Stranger Things Season 4, Part 1, or Stranger Things 4, Part 1. There's many things to kind of draw back on from previous seasons, and there's going to be multiple chapters throughout this video discussing how important and how unimportant certain aspects are, and some things you may have missed along the way in our journey through the Upside Down and through the gates into the real world. So strap yourselves in, make sure to put on your favorite song, and avoid all Demogorgons, Mind Flayers, and Vecna along the way. Chapter 1 of this video is going to be discussing the main antagonist and villain from the Upside Down in Vecna. But before we get into it and break it down step by step and piece by piece, let's discuss these quotes from the Forgotten Realms Wiki, or Wiki, however you want to describe it. The first quote is from Vecna and from Dungeons & Dragons, and it goes as follows. Evil is not an absence of good. It is not a choice. Evil is one of two forces in the cosmos, an agency locked in eternal struggle against its antithesis. Only good and evil exists, and not even a hair's width of space separates them. As I said, from the Forgotten Realms Wiki. Now the second quote is more on Vecna's abilities, or what Vecna likes to prey on. Vecna believed that every being in existence held a single secret that could be manipulated to bring about its destruction. Uncovering that secret and exploiting its truth were the key to gaining dominion over others. And these really go on to kind of paint a picture and create a little roadmap for us to discuss Stranger Things Season 4, Part 1. Now, one thing we learned about Vecna as a villain and what he likes to prey on early on is that most of the time you're going to be getting visions and hallucinations, mostly centered around a clock, which you came to learn later on with Victor Creel and Vecna's fascination with time. Also Henry Creel, but we'll get to that later. But you get a lot of hallucinations, the first one being Chrissy, obviously with Eddie Munson in the cabin, and that's what Eddie was kind of being framed for, was the murder of Chrissy in the show. And you know, all of these people, including Fred Benson, he got a lot of visions and everything like that as well. But these visions aren't just visions leading up to your eventual death and having your eyes ripped out and your entire body twisted around like Reagan from The Exorcist. That's not really what it's about. It's all of these characters that Vecna preys on have a secret and a trauma that really affected their life and changed them as human beings. It's the one deep, dark secret that, if exposed, like we read in that quote, can be the fall of the human and be the fall of humanity from good to evil. And all of the people that Vecna prey on, including Max, which we'll get to later on. Max will probably have her own chapter in this video the longer we go, but everybody has a trauma. And you know what? It's a good thing that Will Byers was not in Hawkins when Vecna was preying on these individuals from the Upside Down and in the real world, because if Will Byers was there, it would have just been a whole nother story, which I'm sure we'll get a glimpse of that at the end of Season 2. Or I'm sorry, at the end of Season 4, Part 2. When it comes to breaking down the different characters' traumas, we're not going to touch on every character, but we will touch on the main ones. Chrissy's trauma was based around her mother and her needing to be perfect and her needing to be, you know, a perfect human being, and just the terrible home life that Chrissy came from, and the verbally and mentally abusive, I believe, mother, which was kind of centered around that show, and how she it was believed to be bulimia, where she was a cheerleader, obviously just trying to be the best she could be, but was destroying herself in the process. So boom, Vecna portrays her mother, which you saw a clip of earlier, in these hallucinations and visions, and really just breaks her down to a literal shell of a human being before he eventually, you know, traps her in that cabin with Eddie Munson there and then flings her up into midair, makes her levitate, bends her legs and her arms all back around, breaks her jaw, breaks her neck, and she just falls into a heap to her death. That was Chrissy. And then you look at Max, who, obviously with Billy's death, and she feels like she was responsible for Billy's death and that she could have done more to help him and to help him break out of that situation with the Mind Flayer, and she didn't. So that's been haunting her ever since Billy's death in season 3. It's been haunting her just in the Battle of Starcourt. She felt like she could have done more and she didn't, so she feels like she's the outcast of the group in Hawkins, but she just feels like she kind of let her brother die, and that's part of the reason that she went to the school counselor, and that's part of the reason why, actually that is the sole reason for her trauma that she suffers, and you see it throughout the season, especially in the chase scene where Max levitates in midair and almost gets destroyed and killed by Vecna after the hallucinations and visions get worse and worse and worse. It is like a virus, but these viruses throughout the seasons get stronger and stronger, and your hallucinations get worse and worse and worse until your eventual death, where you meet Vecna face to face in his world in the Upside Down, and he tries to take you for everything that you are good for and feed off of the weakness he's already created through these visions. And talking about the dream world, and in relation to what a lot of people believe has a huge influence in Vecna as a character in The Nightmare on Elm Street, and in Freddy Krueger from A Nightmare on Elm Street, who, as we said earlier, I believe, if we may have mentioned it, Robert Englund, who plays Freddy Krueger in A Nightmare on Elm Street, actually plays Victor Creel in the mental institution scene with Nancy and Robin. So I believe with the Vecna world inside the Upside Down, with his lair, with the look of Vecna, with the red lighting, with him being burned, as you'll come to see and hear later on as we continue our story in different videos. But I got a serious Freddy Krueger vibe, a serious Freddy Krueger look to Vecna and the way he walked throughout his lair. It reminded me a lot of The Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, and this was Vecna's dream world, like we mentioned earlier. I just constantly kept thinking about Freddy Krueger, and it just, like I said, his mannerisms, the way that Vecna would walk throughout the dream world as he was stalking Max, kind of like a Michael Myers, but with a little bit more swagger, and that's kind of what Freddy Krueger was, with the way he would walk his victims down like an apex predator, and Vecna is the apex predator of the Upside Down. And I think that there's a quote which Dustin says with the Vecna, the Mind Flayer, and the Demogorgon, and we'll probably get to that later, and you probably know what quote I'm talking about as well, but just a serious vibe of an apex predator, Freddy Krueger, A Nightmare on Elm Street, the dream world in relation to Vecna's lair in the Upside Down, the red smoke and everything. It just really screams a Freddy Krueger influence to Vecna. And with Robert Englund being Victor Creel in the mental institution, I think you can connect the dots there, and that's what the series is about. And speaking on the apex predator vibe to Vecna in relation to comparisons to A Nightmare on Elm Street, A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors, and a comparison to Freddy Krueger, Freddy would always attack you in your dreams when you're at your weakest, when you're out of your element. Vecna does the same thing almost, because he's attacking you through these hallucinations to get you weakened, to instill that fear in you, to break you down piece by piece like we already mentioned, and then eventually get you into his world, or have enough power to cross over into our world through the gates that he creates. And we'll talk about the gates before we close out the video, but he weakens you, he destroys you mentally and emotionally through these visions by attacking your weakness and your trauma that you've had throughout your life, which we talked about with those quotes earlier on. And then when he gets you into his realm and his world, that's when he can take you and kind of rip your soul out through your eyes, In closing the proverbial gates from the Upside Down into the real world and back and forth, as you saw throughout the end of Stranger Things 4 Part 1, the thing about Vecna is every time he kills somebody, every time there is a victim, the place in which that victim is taken and their life is taken, there is a gate that opens up. And those gates, as we've learned throughout other seasons, they can create more pathways between the upside down and the real world. That's what the gate is. It's a doorway from the upside down to the real world and the real world to the upside down. And the thing about Vecna is the more victims he takes, the more gates that are open. But the gates are opened in the particular area where that victim was taken. The more gates that are open, the more powerful Vecna becomes, and the easier it is for him to transport between worlds from the upside down to the real world and vice versa. I also feel that as the more connections that Vecna makes, the more victims that he takes, the more tentacles or web-like structures that seem to connect him to what we believe to be the Mind Flayer. Like we said, the Mind Flayer's the ruler. The Demogorgon was his foot soldier, but Vecna is his 5-star general. And we'll throw a quote in from Dustin right here.
Who do we know that wants to take over the world? The Mind Flayer. So if the Demogorgon was just his foot soldier, Vecna's his 5-star general. A 5-star general with the power to open gates.
I mean, there you have it. What else more is there to say after that quote from Dustin about the gates, the Mind Flayer, Vecna, and the Demogorgon? Well, one final thing I'd like to touch on, and we'll probably explain it a little bit more in depth in a separate video, but it's the apparent weakness that Vecna has to music. But not just music, whoever his victim is, it's their favorite song. And I don't think that this has really been explained yet. It's more just that if you have these headphones on and you're listening to your favorite song during the point where Vecna is attacking you, then it opens up that gate to get back into the real world and escape Vecna's grasp. You saw it in the Max chase scene when Max was levitating in midair as Vecna was trying to take her soul and, break her physically, mentally, and spiritually in half, in my opinion. And once they played that song, Running Up That Hill, which was Max's favorite song, it was able to open up that gate and allow Max to move forward and come out of the gate and escape Vecna's lair in the upside down and get back to the real world. And, I think that the real connection between Vecna and music, and more importantly to his victims or whoever he's targeting, is that when these victims have their favorite song being played, it doesn't allow Vecna to control their mind and speak to them to weaken them even more. By listening to their favorite song, and kind of how everybody listens to their favorite song, it puts you in that sense of relaxation. It puts you in that sense of comfort. And I feel like that comfort that the music gives the victims takes away a lot of that fear and intimidation factor that Vecna has. And that music takes away his power and allows you to break out of his curse and break out of Vecna's curse with the music that you're listening to. But it has to be your favorite song, because everybody's favorite song has that deep-rooted internal, emotional, and physical connection to the person who's listening to it. So Vecna can't attack you when you're listening to your favorite song, because it's giving you that sense of relaxation, it's giving you a sense of confidence, I believe, and it's also giving you that sense of happiness, not the dark, gloomy sadness, destruction, and, terrifying presence that Vecna puts you into as he's trying to take you after you start to see those visions. So that's just my little thoughts on the connection that music and Vecna and breaking Vecna's curse has, and it hasn't been fully explained yet, but I feel like that's what it is. And that is going to be it for the first part of our Stranger Things Season 4 Part 1 Connecting the Dots series. I hope you all enjoyed. I hope you got a lot out of this video. I hope it taught you something. I hope you learned something by listening to my brief breakdown on Vecna, his strengths, his weaknesses, and how he ties in to the entire story. Now, obviously, this isn't everything in relation to Vecna. If you've watched Stranger Things 4 Part 1, you'll know that. But there will be more videos breaking down the other characters, the other storylines, and everything in between. So, without any further ado, thank you guys for watching. Thank you for tuning in to the Touch 'Em Up Podcast and the Touch 'Em Up Podcast YouTube channel. And make sure to be prepared if you venture into the Upside Down. And like we said in the beginning, don't forget to bring your favorite song with you.
Get 'em to swap places.